Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Ashew, I'm also going to begin with questions for you. At our last hearing with Ambassador Lighthizer, there was, I think it's fair to say, there was a great deal of frustration on this committee with the administration's decision to determine that Canadian and European steel and aluminum represented threats to our national security. As you point out in your testimony, BIS is responsible for investigating the effects of imports on national security under Section 232. Do you believe that Canada represents a national security threat to the United States?
No, Senator. And if I could elaborate a little bit.
Please.
As you learned from my testimony, the BIS is a national security bureau. So outside of 232, we, for instance, the export control system is one we work with our allies very closely on. And it would not be successful without strong partnerships with multilateral allies. In this particular case, because the oversupply of these metals is a global issue, it's not one that you can simply aim at, say, China and deal with directly. It's a global supply issue. The remedies the administration chose are global in nature, with the provision, and this goes back to the earliest proclamation, to allow for special national security relationships with particular countries. And those are individual bilateral conversations that the administration has. From our perspective at BIS, we work diligently on the product exclusion part, although country negotiations don't occur, obviously, within BIS, but what we do is try to make the process that we own work as efficiently as possible.
So can you describe the process that the administration engaged in making the determination that these were a national security threat?
Well, again, I think the approach was when BIS made its recommendations in the wake of the investigations, we gave several options. And you could legitimately go in several ways. You could go a more narrow, country-by-country approach, or a broader approach from which you make exemptions. And it was the latter that was chosen. And in particular country cases, South Korea is a good example, a negotiated arrangement was done. Those negotiations are occurring. We all know Canada and the U.S. are having conversations now. My assumption is that would include, the broad picture that includes steel and aluminum as well.
So it's my understanding that the Department of Defense released a memorandum to Commerce which stated, and I quote, "DoD continues to be concerned about the negative impact on our key allies regarding the recommended options within the report and recommended targeted tariffs instead of a blanket approach." Did you disregard this memo from DoD in making the determination, or did you take that into consideration?
We certainly, on any 232 investigation, not only does the statute require close consultation with DoD, but it would be wrong and insensible for us not to do that. Having said that, the larger, the larger issue regarding country by country conversations is one that really occurs at the principal level, and I'm sure those conversations occurred, within the administration, and those go well beyond 232 analysis as well.
So those are not shared with your agency, those conversations?
We're very focused on the methodical nature of the 232 process. We do the investigation. And by the way, we consult with any agency that has equities. I mentioned the uranium, close cooperation with energy on that. So that is where our interaction occurs, but obviously we're dealing with some fairly global issues here that go well beyond what BIS is implementing.
Well, I would point out that we had a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday, and the subject of tariffs and trade came up, and Ambassador Burns and former Ambassador Burns and Dr. Richard Haas both expressed their concern about the tariffs. And I will just quote to you what Ambassador Burns said. He said, "The EU is an instrument on the trade issue. It's our largest trading partner and investor. They are our competitors, the Europeans, as well as our partners. They would have been with us on a big trade action against China if we hadn't hit the Europeans first." So I guess the question that I have as we look at some of these tariff decisions is whether they are actually made in the context of what's in the interest of the overall security and economic competitiveness of the United States. And I would raise questions about whether those tariffs against steel and aluminum tariffs against Canada and the EU really were done in that context. So my time is over, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on the issue of transparency in the exclusion or the exemption process. Because Assistant Secretary Ashew, I was troubled to see a report from the McClatchy news organization that OMB Director Mulvaney has been lobbying on behalf of one of his former constituents for an exemption from the steel tariffs. And as the discussion has shown, there is concern about transparency in the process. You acknowledge that. So has BIS received any communication from the White House or from Mr. Mulvaney regarding a specific exclusion application?
No, not to my knowledge. I am, I will say, as the chairman pointed out, this is a pretty complicated process,
Right.
and we really are relying on the experts to do it, and that is what we are doing. There's very, very little in the way of external. Oftentimes, people will come in and we try to meet with folks who have a concern about and we will meet with those affected parties, but beyond that, we keep the external communications and influences on this to an extreme minimum.
Okay, so do I understand you to say definitively that no one in your agency has heard from anyone in the White House or from Mr. Mulvaney with respect to any particular applications?
So it's a big agency, and I don't want to say nobody's heard from anybody.
Can I ask you if you would check with your agency and report back to this committee?
I will
relative to
certainly
that
check, but I
question?
would also reassure you that the BIS has the responsibility to implement this, and I'm running BIS, so I have not, and I think that's a point I want to make sure you understand.
Thank you, I appreciate that. The other thing that's been pointed out is that there is really a disproportionate burden placed on small businesses because this is a very arcane process. Has there been any special outreach to small businesses or any kind of training to help them navigate this process when they have an issue?
Yes, Senator, although I think we need to do more. Within BIS, we pride ourselves on that kind of outreach in everything else we do, in the export control world, et cetera. We've got an office dedicated to outreach. As with everything else, we need to kind of, on the exclusion process, get up to altitude. And this is a different community, so we're trying to adjust to that community. This is where partnerships have been very helpful to us. Associations, we're constantly meeting with associations who are kind of force multipliers on this. But I don't want to mislead you. We need to do more in that.
I'm glad to hear you say that, and I would urge you to do everything you can because small businesses are so critical to increasing trade in this country. And along those lines, I want to ask Assistant Secretary, is it Nakaktar? I understand that one of your major responsibilities, and you talk about this in your testimony, is to help small and medium-sized businesses get access to international markets. In New Hampshire, we've really benefited from the services that have been provided from the Department of Commerce because we've seen a 46% increase in exports in the past 5 years, in large part due to investments that we've made at the state and federal level into trade. So I was struck in your testimony when you talked about the number of staff that you've redeployed to help Mr. Ashew's agency with the exclusion process, that had to be a challenge in terms of the support that you're trying to provide for small and medium-sized businesses. And I know you say in your testimony that you have not jeopardized the ability to vigorously enforce anti-dumping and countervailing duty and conduct other critical programs, but it defies credulity here to think that you could have had 65 staff and contractors working on the exclusion process and still been able to do all of the work that the agency needs to do in other areas. And it seems to me at a time when the President is talking about increasing exports and trade to address our trade deficit, that we've actually been reducing the resources that we need in order to do that. So can you talk about what your agency needs in order to continue to support small and medium-sized businesses get access to international markets?
I'd love to do that, and thank you for the very important question. First, I want to start out with saying that we've all been working incredibly hard to manage all these competing priorities. I will tell you that a lot of us have put in extraordinarily long hours. Anytime a company wants to meet with anybody in my office to talk about how their companies, how their industries are being impacted, I don't turn away a meeting. My secretary and my entire staff knows to not turn away a meeting because everything we do has incredible importance to companies. I will also tell you from a personal experience that I used to represent U.S. industries before I joined the administration. And I personally know, and I represented companies in some of the most economically depressed regions in the United States. And for me, this is personal. And for me, one lost job is one lost job too many. So I take this very seriously, and my staff takes it very seriously. So we've actually stretched ourselves. I think all of us in this room have been in a position where you've just been dealing with an onslaught of work that you just have to stretch yourself, but you make it happen. But is it sustainable in the long run? Absolutely not. So to the issue of have we been addressing small and medium-sized companies' concerns? Absolutely. Now, sometimes reality is that you sometimes have to shift resources. But what we've been doing very carefully and what we've been very careful to do is where can we shift resources from things that aren't pressing right now? That's where we shift resources from. We maintain priorities. We maintain interactions and interfacing and responsiveness to companies that need us right now. And the ones who don't right now, we're shifting those resources to help with the 232 exclusion process and other parts of the administration priorities. So, but as I said, this is completely not sustainable. So we do anticipate an increase in resources and human capital just to get all of this done. And we're happy to work with you more closely on getting something implemented that alleviates some of the strain that's been put on us and enables us to, the things that we've put on hold that aren't so pressing, those are going to be important in the long run, so we can address those too.
Well, thank you. I think this committee agrees with you, which is why we've increased resources for your agencies, despite the budget requests from the administration, which would have reduced them. So
appreciate
thank
that.
you.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.